Rabbi, the learn.
We're in the second paragraph of the Shema. And the second paragraph tells us that if you heed the dictates of the Torah, which I command you today, to love God with all your hearts and with all your souls. So we discussed the other day that when we say in the Shema, to serve God with all your heart, what is that referring to? So the Talmud tells us, what is the service of the heart? That's tefillah. Eza avodah shebalev, that's tefillah. And we've mentioned the argument, the Rambam and Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, is it a Torah obligation? It's only rabbinical. And the interpretation that it's for tefillah, that's called a reliance. It's a rabbinical interpretation, rabbinical takeaway. So we'd asked, what does tefillah, which is supplication of God, what realms does it have to do with Kabbalah Sol mitzvos, with accepting the yoke of our obligation to observe mitzvos? What does tefillah have to do with this? So we explained that the two opening words of the second paragraph, V'yom Shua Tishmu, is referring to the study of Torah. V'yoim Shemoah, that if you review what you had learned and you retain that, Tishmu, whenever you learn that same subject matter, you're going to see, have new insights and come upon new understandings of that same Torah. Im Shemoah, if you retain the old, through reviewing, when you study it again, you will see things which you didn't realize before. So there's always be a new insight and there's an excitement. That's what the Torah is saying. So it's not a reiteration, but rather the first word is referring to the past, what you had studied in the past, and the new, when it says you will have a new level of understanding, that's due to reviewing the past. Now it's very interesting. We read in Pirkei Avos, the Torah itself, everything, if the Torah is the blueprint for existence, that means every aspect of existence is contained in the Torah. We read the Torah at whatever level we read it, whatever we understand it. Are we able to correlate the galaxies, the depths of the ocean, every species of animal, every herb, the spiritual worlds, angels? How? We can't. But factually, the blueprint for every aspect of existence, material and spiritual, whatever level, it lies in the Torah. It's the blueprint. As a result of that, the more you delve into it, and if you're privy to the secrets of the Torah, what lies within those words, everything is contained in that, because the Torah itself is the blueprint of existence. So therefore, if you review the old, meaning you value what you had studied, God will give you new insights in that same subject matter, that you come upon new horizons. Due to what? To your commitment to what you already had studied. Now, we had asked the question, we find in the Shema, if you keep what I command you today, Asher Noch Mitzav Chayom. So we asked the question, the Gemara asked, the Talmud asked the question, the Torah was given at Sinai. It's not given today. So what does it mean? Asher Noch Mitzav Chayom. That I command you today. So Chazal tell us, when you study the Torah, it should be as if it's something new, like a new proclamation. Because an old proclamation, people hear an old proclamation, that we've heard it before. But if it's a new proclamation, people have an interest, because there's something there that they haven't heard before. So whenever you study the Torah, it should be as if it was given at Sinai today. It's a new proclamation. It's not an old proclamation. So we're discussing, firstly, how do you achieve that? How do you keep that freshness and that uniqueness that whenever you come upon it, you experience as if it's a new experience, a new insight? How? It's very difficult. You have to be like an angel. You have to revere God to such a degree. It's like you have the Hope Diamond. And because you're the only one who has that diamond, whenever you look at it, it's like the first time you looked at it. That's how special it is. Because it's so unique. So you have to see the Torah in such a unique context that whenever you study it, it's like the first time you're approaching it. But how do you achieve that? It's almost impossible. How many people at that level? But according to what we're saying now, it's a whole different understanding. Oyem Shema. If you review the old, Tishmu, God will give you another level of understanding, which you didn't understand initially. So every time you study it, you're going to come upon new horizons. So therefore, it's as if it was the first time you studied it. It's like you're amazed. I never knew this before. Now you have new levels of understanding of things you didn't understand before. If that's the case, there's always a continuous excitement. So what it means, you should study it as if it was given today. That means by reviewing the old and showing you value it, God will give you that divine assistance, that because everything is embedded in the Torah, because that's the blueprint of existence, you will come upon new understandings, and that's what will excite you as if it was given today. It's as if the first time you ever heard it. We find that Moshe Rabbeinu had a speech impediment. How did it come about, a speech impediment? So the Midrash tells us that initially there was a decree because the stargazers, the astrologers in Egypt said that the Redeemer of Israel was born at this period of time, and ultimately his demise will come through water. So they issued a decree that all Jewish children, male children that are born, have be thrown into the Nile. And Yocheved, Moshe's mother, because Moshe was born prematurely, so she was able to hide him, conceal him for a number of months. But once it was full term, although he was born 2 months earlier, they began searching out to see if there was a child born there. So she fashioned a box, she put him in the Nile. And the Torah tells a story that the daughter of Pharaoh went to bathe, and she sees this box floating. She reaches out, she finds a Jewish child, and she adopts the child. She adopts the child. And he became the adopted grandchild of Pharaoh. Now, who originally had given the advice at how to bring about the final solution of the Jewish people? To institute bondage and slavery at an inhuman level. On an inhuman level, that was Bilam. Bilam was the advisor to Pharaoh. And they instituted it. Because through that, you will destroy them. Humanly, it's not survivable. That was the whole understanding. So what happened? Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was put in the Nile, the astrologers had said that the Redeemer of Israel has died. Because the only reason why Moshe Rabbeinu survived the Nile was a miracle. But on the natural level, he should have drowned. So as a result of that, the decree of what? Of male children being killed ceased. Because the Redeemer, the guarantee, there's no Redeemer. The Jews are there forever. So if Moshe is alive, evidently he's not the Redeemer. Moshe is sitting on the lap of Paro, and Paro loves him even more than a natural grandchild. And he's sitting on his lap, and Moshe, this little boy, 2 years old, takes the crown of Paro and puts it on his own head. Takes the crown of the most advanced civilization, puts it on his own head. And everybody is smiling, they're excited. Bilam takes on a demeanor, says that child has to be put to death immediately. That he took your crown, put it on his head, that means he will destroy Egypt. That's what Bilam said. And he's the Redeemer. They said, how could be the Redeemer? The astrologer said, the star said, the Redeemer of Israel is not alive. He said, I'm telling you, he's the Redeemer. He will destroy your country. This action of taking your crown, putting it on his head means it's over. He must be put to death immediately. He said, he's a child. He didn't know what he was doing. He says he knows exactly what he was doing. He took the crown to remove it from you, to strip you of your monarchy, and he will take over the monarchy. They said, impossible. He's 2 years old. What does he understand? So Bilam says, we'll do a test. We'll take a plate of hot glowing coals. We'll take a plate with gold nuggets, which actually sparkle and radiate. And we'll see which plate he goes to. If he reaches for the hot coals or he reaches for the gold nuggets. What do you think Moshe was reaching for? For the gold nuggets? So if that would be the case, they would kill him, because that means he's more than a precocious child. He knows exactly what he's doing. As Moshe reaches for the gold nuggets, Hashem says, Gabriel, the archangel, and he pushes his hand to the glowing hot coals. Moshe Rabbeinu takes the hot coal, puts it to his lips, and he actually burns his lips and burns the tip of his tongue. So Moshe had a speech impediment. This is how Moshe Rabbeinu, why he wasn't able to articulate the words properly, appropriately, because he had a speech impediment, because he burnt his lips and his tongue. Okay? Fast forward 80 years later. Moshe's at the burning bush. God comes to him, and as if he fled to Midian, he's shepherding the flock of his father-in-law. And God says to Moshe, you will be the Redeemer. You go to Paro and you tell him, I am the representation of the God of Israel. Let my people go. So Moshe says to God, I am representing the creator of the world. It says Pharaoh had 70 interpreters, because whoever would come to the palace, if he spoke another language and he wanted to communicate, they had an interpreter to interpret his whatever language he spoke. And they're representing mortals. I come and I represent the God of Israel, the creator, and I can't get a word out of. I come and stammer. It's a disgrace. It's a chil Hashem. How do you expect me to represent you? I will disgrace you. Therefore, you should find someone else to fill that position. Aaron. So God says to Moshe, and who gives anybody the ability to articulate words appropriately and clearly and distinctly. It's me. What are you worried? If I tell you you're going to speak, you're going to speak. We find, the speaking donkey with Bilam. If God wants you to speak, you speak. So but the Midrash says, Adam, for first creation of man, he said, he knew 70 languages. This is before the 70 root nations came into existence. He says, how did he know 70 languages? Did somebody teach him the 70 languages? He didn't know it. Nobody taught him, but he knew the 70 language. He was fluent in 70 languages. How? Now we find when Adam was created, he was at a level, it says he was able to see from one end of the world to the other. When he named the species, they put a label on them. He understood their physical makeup and the spiritual makeup, and he understood exactly how they fit into creation, why God created them, why they're necessary for the totality of creation. That was the level of Adam, his understanding. That's what it means. He saw from one end of the world to the other. He was endowed with a level of understanding which is not to be understood. If there's 70 languages, that means within creation, there is a basis. There can be 70 nations who speak 70 languages. So if you understand every aspect of creation, and the 7 languages part of creation, Adam understood the 70 languages. He could speak 70 languages because he was proficient in everything, because he was endowed with that level of clarity. So therefore he was able to speak 70 languages. So that's what Hashem says to Moshe. What are you worried that you're representing me? You're going to stammer? Whoever taught Adam the 70 languages, but because he was endowed with the level of clarity, it wasn't a problem. Moshe, if you're representing me, it's not a problem. You're not going to stammer any longer. Because it means that if you're representing me and there can't be a desecration of God's name, that means you can articulate those words perfectly. Because that's part of creation. So what are you concerned? But Moshe went back and forth factually. He came up with other reasons. So Hashem said, Aaron, your brother, will be your spokesman. So until Sinai, Moshe had a speech impediment. At Sinai, before the sin of the golden calf, what happened? All Jews were healed. As it says, they all stood and saw. That means nobody was blind, nobody was lame. That means every physical defect that a person had, they immediately recovered. They achieved a perfect state. Moshe Rabbeinu, at that moment, was able to articulate because he was also healed from the speech impediment. At that moment, after the Chet Egel, after the sin of golden calf, everybody reverted back to the previous state. So everybody regained that original physical defect. So whoever was blind became blind again. Whoever was lame became lame. But Moshe Rabbeinu, who was not affected by the Chet Egel, by the sin of the golden calf, he retained that original status. He achieved the level of perfection. So Moshe Rabbeinu was able to articulate it perfectly. He was still at the pre-sin of the golden calf. So therefore Moshe Rabbeinu had perfect articulation. That's the understanding. If you study the Torah and you come upon new horizons, as I said, you're always excited. I'll give you an example. There's a book that was written. There's a Rabbi Bender who has a school out in Far Rockaway. And his father was a very special man. He was born in Europe as a little boy. We're talking about in maybe 1916. And his father came to the United States as a fundraiser to raise money for yeshivas in Europe. And he lived up in Rockland County. In those days, the law was that, they had truant offices. You had to send your child for public education. So his father did not want his child to be exposed to the secular culture of America. There was no Hebrew education, Jewish education. So he homeschooled him. And he kept him really concealed until he was the age of 13, 14, till the age where he didn't have to go to public school any longer. That's what he did. In the 20s, there was a yeshiva in Brooklyn that was established, Torah Vodaas. And eventually he went to Torah Vodaas. Torah Vodaas, that time, needed a Rosh Yeshiva, needed somebody who had the yeshiva. So he had written, so Mr. Mendelovich, who was really the architect of the education of that yeshiva, even though he's a great Torah scholar, he always wanted to be called Mr. Mendelovich, Mr. Mendelowitz, Mendelovich, that's what they called him. And he himself created the infrastructure of education. He was a first-class educator. And he was even the Rebbe of Mr. Glick, Louis Glick, when he was a little boy, he was an orphan. He took him under his wing until the age of 16. And he really gave him an understanding of many things. And so this Rabbi Bender, his name is Rabbi David Bender, he needed somebody, he had to grow and advance in Torah. So Mr. Mendelovich sent a letter to Europe, to Rav Chaim Over Grzinski, who was the leading Torah sage of the world, that we need somebody who you choose to come from Europe and accept the position to head the yeshiva, the Torah Vodaas. Of course, the students, they need somebody to mentor them, to advance them. So he sent, the person's name was Shlomo Hyman. Shlomo Hyman, Zech Tzadik L'Bracha, was the Rishib of Torah Vodaas. And first class, but factually speaking, because the environment in America, and he was one person, the opportunity to grow in Torah and to become that special level of Torah scholar didn't exist. So what happened? So his father, and he was an only child. There's David Bender. So he said he's going to send him to Europe to study in Europe, in the Mir Yeshiva. Because the Mir Yeshiva in Mir, Poland, was known as one of the elite yeshivas, where they mentor and develop the most advanced level of scholarship. So he moved to Europe. He sent to Europe, but he was the only child. So his mother moved to Mir with him, and they rented an apartment, and his mother took care of him. Meaning other students went there to rent a room somewhere. They were boarders. They had to fend for themselves for food. His mother went with him. She set up home for him, and he lived together with his mother. His mother would cook for him, take care of laundering his clothing, that he should not be distracted. So when he went there, he had many friends, Americans, who were studying Torah Vodaas. He writes them. The first Rishib wasn't Shlomo Hyman. His name was Rav David Leibowitz. Rav David Leibowitz, his son was Rav Henech Leibowitz, started Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva in the United States. This is Shema Chofetz Chaim. So he says, if you understand, a person sees the light of dawn, you think that's light, because compared to darkness, it's light. But when you see sunrise, you understand that dawn is not light. He says, when you're in the United States, you think that's great scholarship. When you go to Europe and you see the luminaries, now you understand what it's really about. So he wrote letters to all his friends, encouraging them to come to Europe, to study in Europe. And there were about 10 young men who left their families and went to study in Europe. They were all born in America, in the United States, and they studied in the Mir Yeshiva due to his encouragement, and they came to Europe, and they became major Talmidei Chacham Torah scholars, because it was another level. It was the environment here and the number of people who would create that environment were lacking in the United States. We're talking, this is in the 30s, in the early 30s. That's what they went. So a person studies, and he studies it again and again and again. They say, look, I'm going nowhere. So if you feel going nowhere, what happens? You say, I'm checking out. Every time you study, the Rebbe teaches you, he gives you a new level of understanding, which is amazing. And you're amazed. And you realize whatever level of intellectual which exists out there, there's nothing compared to this level of intellectualism. I'll give you an example. There are no fallacies in the Talmud. None. Could you imagine? Meaning that the level of intellectual analysis, they did not leave. So, and very often when I taught, and I still teach, Baruch Hashem, we have people who have very advanced degrees from Stanford, Harvard, all these universities. And they say, Rabbi, it doesn't make any sense. That was this comment. I said, whatever the person's there, I said, it makes sense. You don't understand. Take time, you'll understand. When you understand, then you'll understand how it makes sense. So now, thank God, some of them are learning with me for 30, 39 years. And I come upon an insight I presented. I said, whatever you studied in university, whatever business deal you did, have you ever experienced such an insight which excites you to this level? They said, never. Understand? If this is the so-called blueprint for existence, that means Einstein's theory of real relativity, that's in the Torah. If you have that understanding, you have that level of clarity, you come upon that reality. And even beyond that, there's a person, Edward Teller, lived in San Francisco, the father of the hydrogen bomb. He was a semi-traditional Jew. Okay, that's what he was. So whatever it took to understand that lies in the Torah. Because there's nothing in existence, because if the Torah is the blueprint, every understanding of whatever may be is there. So if you understand the Torah at that level, it's not a problem. You come upon everything. It was known, the Vilna Gaon, secular scholars, astronomers, chemists, scientists, there were times he would allow them to come to pick his brain. And they would present difficulties, whether it was in mathematics, quantum physics, whatever it was. And they would say, we have difficulty. And he would show them the reason why they had difficulty is because there's a certain point in their approach, analytical, intellectual thesis, it was flawed. And once he showed them exactly where they made the mistake, everything fit perfectly. The Vilna Gaon would never enter into this kind of dialogue with these kinds of people. They would come and they'd present their problem, he'd resolve it within a moment. What's his training? The Vilna Gaon was a level of understanding. He preceded people hundreds of years before him. That's how profound. He had insights. I told you, he was once studying something about the Meraglim, and in the moment, he had 1,200 interpretations. When Moshe Rabbeinu instructed the Meraglim, Alu Zeb HaNegev, when they go into Israel, they should enter on the southern point. He had, in one moment, 1,200 interpretations of that word. Those words. How's it possible? 1,200 understandings come in one moment. This is divine. This divine inspiration, God endows you divinely. Once it's divine, there's no such thing as limitation. There's no limitation. So you're able to comprehend 1,200 pieces of information simultaneously at one moment. Could you understand what it is? So if you come upon and you touch it at that level, how could you not be excited? It's chadoshos. It's always a new proclamation. You always have new insights. When you have that understanding, we have an understanding of God. But if you have an inkling of who he is, you serve God with all your heart. What is the service of the heart? The service of the heart is what? It's tefillah. But that's juxtaposed to the study of Torah, because the only way you could have an appreciation of who God is only if you study the Torah, review it, retain it, and you continue to come upon new insights. And every insight gives you a new understanding that you have only an infinitesimal understanding of who God is. And therefore you serve him with all your heart. And when you enter into an audience, you understand who he is and who you are, and you understand that without him, you don't exist. That's the understanding. You serve him with all your life, even to give your life. It was known that the American soldiers who fought in World War II, they fought differently than the people who fought in the Vietnam War. The level of patriotism of these young men, and there were many people who were drafted into the United States Army. They came from observant families. The handful of people who were really devout Jews, they were drafted into the United States Army, and they fought valiantly. They won. Had commendations and all kinds of things. But you're fighting. You're not fighting God's war, but because these people were born in the 1920s, during when they understood what it means, what freedom means, and what life means, and you don't take anything for granted, and they knew all that was at stake, they fought to give their lives. That's how committed and dedicated they were, because they understood the value of freedom and the value of whatever the United States represented. They fought differently. Why? Because they had that understanding, appreciation for what the United States represented. But if you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and you're ROTC, and they take you 18 hours from the college campus to Vietnam, you have an appreciation of what you have. As they used to say, you're lucky your father was born before you. That's what they used to say. How do you make a small fortune? Your father leaves a big fortune. You end up with a small fortune. That's the way it is. So do you have an appreciation for what things are? It's only if you have an understanding of what they are, then you have an appreciation. When do you give your life to God? As we're saying, this is all, if a person studies and you have an inkling of who God is, and now it's a question, do you turn your back on God, or you give your life for God? You give your life for God. Because if you understand God and the whole value of life is only serving God, so if this is the ultimate service of God, you give your life. Therefore, it follows. You study, come new insights, you have a greater understanding of who he is. When you have that audience, you understand who you're privileged to stand before. And even that level of understanding gives you the understanding of value, that the ultimate value of your life is to give your life for him. Then you merit the ultimate. It's only because you have that appreciation of what he is. So everything follows. Now, in this week's parsha, this week's reading, we read about the mitzvah of bikurim, bringing the new fruits. The Torah tells us that a Jew, the farmer, he has to bring the first fruits or grain that ripen. He has to identify it, and he has to bring it as a gift to the Temple Mount, and give it to the Kohen, who's God's representative. And when he brings the basket with the fruits, whatever it is, the species of Israel, the grains or the fruits, which are the species of Israel, he makes a declaration. He brings the fruit, the basket, puts it on the side of the altar, makes a declaration. What's the declaration? It's a declaration of appreciation. And it goes all the way back to when Yaakov had fled with his family from Lavan, and how Lavan wanted to destroy Yaakov and his family, and how God intervened. And only because God's intervention, Yaakov was able to continue. Arami Ovid Ovi, something we say in the Agora, Pesach night at the Seder. And we went to Egypt, and God redeemed us from Egypt with his outstretched hand with the miracles. And then he brought us to Canaan, to the promised land. And each Jew received his portion. And we conclude, and this is the fruit of the land that you gave us. The first of, therefore, this is the expression of our appreciation to you. That's the mitzvah bikurim. And then the person, after he finishes making his declaration, he prostrates himself on the floor of the Temple Mount before God. That's the ultimate expression of negation. I'm full prostration means I'm like the dust of the earth in your presence. I'm nothing. Total negation. That's what he does. That's the mitzvah bikurim. So the mitzvah is what? To declare your appreciation for God. Public statement. And you have to say it not in an undertone, it has to be said a very audible tone. So that's the positive commandment. So the Midrash tells us that since Moshe Rabbeinu saw through his divine vision that the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed, the temple will be destroyed, and the mitzvah bikurim will not exist any longer, because that mitzvah only has relevance if there is a Beis Hamikdash, if there's a temple. So he legislated that Jews should pray 3 times a day. In the place of the bikurim, of the new fruits, Jews should pray 3 times a day. Because he foresaw the destruction of the temple. So what would be compensate for that? Prayer 3 times a day. So the opposite question is, what does praying 3 times a day have to do with the bikurim? Bikurim is an expression of your beholdenness, appreciation for God, what he gave you. Tefillah is a supplication. We ask God for A to Z and backwards and forwards. And every conceivable need we have, we're making that request. But when you do that, somehow you're compensating. It's the equivalent of the bikurim. What's the commonality between bikurim and tefillah and avodah shebelev? That's the service of the heart. So first I ask the question, the word avodah. We read in Pirkei Avos, Al Shloshet Dvarim Olam Omeid. The world stands on 3 principles. Torah, avodah. Avodah is the service of the temple or tefillah, and Gevil Sasodim, acts of living kindness. So the question is, why is the service of the temple, when you bring a sacrifice, why is that called avodah? So you'd say because the Kohen has to officiate in a special way, and he's bound by certain protocols. That's avodah. That's his job, so to say. That's his responsibility. That's avodah. Person goes to work. You can have white collar job, but that's your work. So the Kohen, that's his avodah. But avodah also has a connotation. It's work. It's a level of accomplishment. It's not so simple. Not so easy. Now, Ramban writes, when a person brings a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, what should his mindset be when he brings that animal? He brings a sin offering, he brings a guilt offering, whatever offering he brings which has relevance to atonement. What does he have to think in his mind? Now, firstly, when you bring a sacrifice to the temple, it's only for an inadvertent sin. A person was unaware it was Shabbos, he violated Shabbos. He was unaware of certain things, he brings the korban. If it's deliberate, one cannot bring that about, that atonement with a sacrifice. Not, you have to work it out some other way. The sacrifice is only for inadvertent. Now, why does one have to bring a sacrifice for something which you transgressed inadvertently? The answer is, when you violate a Torah law, let's say you violate Shabbos. I never intended to violate Shabbos. If I would have known, I wouldn't have done it. I thought it was Sunday, it happened to be Saturday. If I would have known that this action is a creative activity, I wouldn't have done it. Now I know I wouldn't do it again. You have to bring a sacrifice. You have to be atoned. Why? The answer is, if a person believes something is fresh, bacteria-free, and he eats it, not knowing it's actually, it has E. coli bacteria, and he ingests it. Does he get sick? He gets sick. Why? But I paid. It should be first quality. It should not be tainted. But factually, if you ingest something which has bacteria, that kind of bacteria, your system cannot tolerate it, and you could die from it, or you can become very sick from it, unless you have something to counter that bacteria, to conquer it. God created the Jewish soul, spirituality, that when you cross certain lines, you ingest certain things, it impacts negatively on your spiritual makeup. That's what happens. So it has nothing to do with intent. It's just the reality of what you ingested or what you participated in. Years ago, everything was insulated with asbestos. Years later, they realized that asbestos causes cancer, especially when you're exposed to it when it's opened up. Nobody ever knew. They meant well. But does that mean to say the person's could be a victim of cancer because of what asbestos is? He inhaled it or exposed to it. It has nothing to do with intent. Crossing certain lines, because innately those lines are contradictory to your spirituality, automatically your spirituality is negated. Now, when a person does tshuva, the Talmud tells us if you bring a sacrifice and it's not predicated on repentance, it cites a verse, Zevach Risham Toeva. The sacrifice of an evil person is an abomination. You mean you think you could pay off God? I always say, at one time, the translation for korban was sacrifice. Today we've become very sophisticated. Offering. It's an offering. You understand? It's like a person goes to God and says, God, I'll make a deal with you. I'll make you an offer. You know something? God doesn't need your offer. God is the provider. You're making him an offer. The only thing we can do for God is sacrifice. You bring a sacrifice, God says, then there's what to talk about. You're making me an offering. I don't need your offer. I could buy and sell you infinite times over. You only exist because I will, and you're making me an offering. So sacrifice means there is an aspect of what's the sacrifice? So the Ramban writes that when you bring that animal, what has to be the mindset of the person? That in fact, because of the transgression, the way you were affected negatively, and the way your spirituality was diminished, you have to appreciate God's kindness, that he gives you an opportunity that this animal should be in your stead. And when they slaughter the animal, it's as if you're being slaughtered. And when they sprinkle the blood, it's as if your blood is being sprinkled. And when they burn its remains, it's like you're being burnt. And if you have that appreciation of what you deserve, and God is agreeable to take this in your place due to his mercy, then you're atoned. You think that's so easy to achieve, to have that mindset? It's a monumental level of achievement. Was it so terrible? Did I really mean it? But if you appreciate what violating Shabbos means, how it affects you negatively, and without it, it's a hopeless situation. It's only due to God's mercy that he's allowing you to follow this protocol, because it's valued as if you're being killed. To be able to visualize that in your mind, you need a tremendous amount of focus and negation and humility to appreciate what God is saying. God, I don't understand it. I disagree. I don't think it's so terrible. It's like saying to a person has a 60 IQ and he says to Einstein, and he barely can say the words, what you're saying is unintelligent. The 60 IQ says to Einstein, what you're saying is unintelligent. You know what this is? You're saying to God, I don't appreciate, I can't understand what's so terrible. God says, something, you're about to expire and you don't understand what's so terrible. That's how sick you are. That's how ill you are. So the more you appreciate how you've been impacted negatively, but that's all based on humility, so that's an achievement. That's a sacrifice. The greatest sacrifice is when you sacrifice your ego. You swallow your ego and you submit. That sacrifice. That's why the sacrifice, the korban, is called sacrifice. person is a farmer. God says, once a year you bring the new fruits, the first of the fruits, first of the grains, and you make your declaration of appreciation in a location where you sense God's presence. Normally, a person has a tendency, as we just read 2 weeks ago, when a person succeeds, what does a person feel? That the success is due to his own level of participation. And what happens? You say, all my success is due to the power of my arm. It's due to me. And v'ram levavcha, and your heart becomes elevated. You get a swollen head. And what happens? You forget God. It's like people say, thank God I don't need God. Thank God I inherited a business. Thank God I have that education. What are you talking about? So forget about God. You're God yourself, right? Whatever you are, you think you are. At one moment, God could pull the rug from under you and you don't even exist. So you need a level of humility to appreciate that all you are, you're a pawn on the board. And he just moves you around. You can be on top of the wheel of fortune, and in the second you be on the bottom of the wheel of fortune. You'll need one turn from the top to the bottom. That's how quickly you could go. So you have to thank God that he keeps you on top. Because in one moment he could topple you. But that's humility. That's not so simple. To be able to suppress your ego and not take credit for it, not so simple. But the portion of the Bikurim, bring those new fruits. You make your declaration. And when you make it, you have a sense of God's presence. Then you prostrate yourself. So you're doing an action which is actualizing what you're saying. I'm dust in your presence. Then you feel that you're truly nothing. That's a tremendous sacrifice. That's what the Bikurim represent. But it's very interesting. We read in this week's reading, we'll say that after you prostrate yourself, the Torah says, "V'samachtem b'chol hatov." You will rejoice in all the good that God gives you. You got it. People say, I'm not happy. I thought I would make more this year. I thought I'd be able to afford more. God would give me more. You know something? If you look at yourself in the mirror and see that you're healthy and your children are okay, you thank God a million times instead of looking at the other person's love of success. You'd be appreciative for what's minuscule. So why don't you appreciate? Because in terms of the way I see myself, I believe I deserve more. But what about if you negate it and you realize that your value is worthless? You're dust in God's presence, and God gives you something. You rejoice as small as it may be. If it's God-given and you recognize that, you could rejoice even that, because if it's God-given, he gave you that, evidently you don't need more than that. And therefore you can even be appreciative for less, you don't need the more. But you need the negation of the ego. Because now you understand, it's like a person, he can eat 15 courses at a meal. Within 6 months, he's obese, and he's already, at the age of 20, he has diabetes. Diabetes due to his obesity. He's overweight. And he's this and that. He thought he's on top of the world, but he's digging his grave with his fork over there. But if you would have eaten responsibly, less, you understand what your health predicament would have been. You would have been in a safe territory. So if you understand that God gives you less and you're not supposed to have more, you could even rejoice in that. Because since you understand now who God is, because you've negated yourself, you're able to rejoice even in any amount of material that he gives you, he provides you, because you don't need more than that. That's in your best interest. That's what Bikurim is. It's an exercise in understanding, putting things in perspective, and deflating your ego to be appreciative of who God is and who you're not. The Amidah is the same thing. It's recognizing whoever you are, whatever you are, it's due to God's endowment. And therefore you have to supplicate him for everything, for your health, for your material. There's nothing that you have that's not endowed by him. So what is that? It's not easy to swallow. You mean to say my success is my success? I'm healthy because I don't have the genes. And therefore we live till 170 years old, despite everything else. Yeah, but why are you endowed with those genes? And even with the genes, a person could pass away 80 years before his grandfather passed away. Everything is endowment of God. Therefore, you have to be appreciative of everything in life. But how do you put that into focus? You know how you put it in focus? The Amidah. You have that audience with God. And you have to come with your hat in your hand and beg intelligence, forgiveness, healing, blessing, everything from A to Z. That's the exercise of humility. It's putting things in perspective. So therefore, the Amidah is a place of the new fruits that since Moshe Rabbeinu had foreseen the temple being destroyed and we're not able to bring the Bikurim, he legislated the 3 times a day prayer because that takes the place, that puts things in perspective that it's not us, but it's him.